So we are ready to begin our third lesson, which is going to focus on the Talmud. And what we're going to do tonight is continue what we've been doing in our course, trying to understand what that particular genre of Torah is that we're discussing in that particular class. Tonight's class is going to, there's scattered text that we're going to look at during class. Much of it will be on the screen. So it's going to start from, I believe, page 96 tonight. But I'll get to that in a second. I believe so. Okay. So like we did in the previous classes, we tried to understand what it is that particular genre of Torah is, what the history of that particular genre of Torah is, and finally to get a taste of that particular genre of Torah. So tonight we are going to get a little bit of the figure out what Talmud is. We're going to discuss a little bit to get a picture of the history of the Talmud, and finally get a little bit of a taste of the Talmud. Now, in the text, in the book, they give two different texts towards the end of options. I chose the first one as a taste, and I don't believe I removed all the slides because I don't believe that we'll get to the second one tonight. I particularly appreciate and enjoy the history of the Talmud and what's involved in the Talmud and so on. So let's go right into it. I was once giving a Talmud class, and we were having discussions back and forth. And at some point in the middle of the class, one of the participants went like this. Why? You see, you can't put that on the audio because they won't see it. Why did he do that? Because he said, to him it was like so backward and so roundabout that he couldn't wrap his hand there. It's like, why can't you just scratch your ear like this? Why do you have to go like this, right? There are so many principles in the Talmud. You really, as you're studying Talmud, you're building and building and building blocks to be able to understand. If you read a text of the Talmud, yeah, sometimes it does look like they're going like this. But if you start appreciating the background, the principles, how Talmud is structured, you start to appreciate. And I think tonight, our goal is that we should walk out feeling comfortable, understanding what Talmud is and basically how it works. I mean, if you really want to know all the intricacies of how the Talmud works, you got to go and study Talmud. And tonight's class will not be enough for that. But hopefully it'll be a taste so that we would want to go and study a little bit more Talmud. But another little joke that they tell of this guy comes to the rabbi and he says, my friend encouraged me that I should come and study Talmud. I want to know what the Talmud is. Can you tell me what the Talmud is? So he says, I'll tell you what the Talmud is. He says, you tell me if what you think. Two guys two thieves climb down a chimney. Okay. One comes out with a black face. The other one, his face is clean. Which one do you think is going to wash their face? So the guy says, obviously the guy who has a dirty face. He's going to wash his face. So the rabbi says, no. I'll explain to you. The guy who comes down with a dirty face, he sees the other guy. He has a clean face. So he's not going to wash his face. But the guy who comes down the chimney and sees the other guy with a dirty face, he's going to think his face is dirty and he's going to wash his face. So the rabbi says, okay, You agree? Makes sense? The guy says, yeah. So the guy says, yeah, makes sense. So Rabbi says, I don't know if you're ready for Talmud. He says, Alex, ask you something. He says, I'll tell you like this. He says, really, I have to remember one last part of it. 1 second. Oh, so the rabbi says, you're wrong. Why? He says, because if two thieves come down the same chimney, it's impossible that one of them's going to have a clean face and one of them's going to have a dirty face. So that whole thing that I said before doesn't make sense. You agree? So the guy says, yeah, makes sense. He says, I'll tell you, you're wrong again. He says, why? Okay, so he says he agreed that both of them are going to wash their face. So he says, I'm sorry, I told this once today and it worked. But the punchline is good and the point is what's important here. So the rabbi says, I'll tell you like this. Neither of them are going to wash their face. And you want to know why? Because they're thieves. And thieves come in, they quickly want to steal whatever they can steal and get out of there. They're not going to wash their face. Make sense? Okay. So the Talmud works like that. The Talmud analyzes, I'm going to see tonight, the Talmud is going to analyze every single detail of every single thing that they're going to discuss. But let's try to understand what the Talmud is. I know using this story joke. So I had a teacher who was called to jury duty. And he, at the end of the first day, they basically told him, go home. It's not going to work. So what do you mean? I mean, he wasn't upset. But what happened? So they said, you can't come with any conclusions. He used his Gemara head. So first he said to everyone, I'll tell you what I think. And everyone says, well, what a good idea. That makes sense. Everybody agrees. And then he explained for another half hour why it doesn't make any sense. What he explained. So he said, he gave another option. Everybody agreed. They thought he's right. He says, I'll tell you why that doesn't make sense either. And they were never ending. They couldn't come to a conclusion because that's the way he studied in yeshiva. That's the way he taught. He was teaching Talmud, and that's the way the Talmud works. You never come to a conclusion because you keep coming and analyzing from a different direction. We once had a principal, a Rosh Yeshiva, who called us for a meeting, and he wanted to hear from us what we thought. And every suggestion we gave, he had already analyzed it and had a reason why it wouldn't work. Like it's as if that's the way he's thinking. He studies Gemara. No, this doesn't make sense. Now I'll find a reason why. If someone's studying Gemara full time, that's the way they work. Now there are people, their job is to figure out what the law is, and they have to work a little bit differently, obviously. And it works like that with Jewish studies. So that's we'll get next week. We'll get into halacha, into Jewish law. But let's focus now. Now that I gave you a few little stories as an introduction, let's go into the way the Talmud works. So basically, what we discussed is the idea of pilpul. What this is called is pilpul, where you discuss and you analyze from every possible angle, and that is one of the things that the Talmud does. Okay, going back a slide here. So week number 1, being that I can't see it on my screen, it's too small. We have the gray shaded area there, which is the timeline of the map of the Torah, which we explained in week 1 is the written Torah, Torah Shebichtav, which is Tanakh, the 24 books of Torah, which is 5 books, the Nevi'im, the prophets, and the Ketuvim and the writings. Then we discussed last week the red line, which is the Midrashic works. Much of it which was during the time of the Talmud and is included in the Talmud. And this week we're going to be looking at the Talmud, which is the orange line. So if you're looking at your map, you do have a map in the front of your book. I have one here too at some point. If you have one, so you could look at that a little bit more clearly. You could see where we are, and it gives you at the bottom where you could see the years where that particular genre of Torah was established or written or discussed, as we'll see what each one is. Okay. So, let's put the map away. Let's begin. So we did the pilpul. Okay. After the pilpul means to discuss, to analyze. It's Hebrew. It's Aramaic actually. Lefalfel, to probe. I think that's the literal translation. So you want to really get into and discuss and analyze. Okay. Now, what's important to know, and we'll explain why this is so, is that after the Tanakh, after the 24 books of the Tanakh, the most central part of Judaism, of Torah, of the oral Torah, is the Talmud. And we're going to explain why that is. Let's have a look first at a page of the Talmud. So I want to ask you, before I show you a page of the Talmud, does anybody know what this is? Can you guess?
Talmud.
Okay, you guessed it's the Talmud, and you're right. Okay, but what I want to tell you is that this is actually one out of 63 volumes of the Talmud.
Wow.
Okay, if you look inside this thing, and I'll put on the screen a page, I'm going to show you what the page of the Talmud looks like. Okay. Whoop.
Did you hear? You good?
Yeah, I'm good. Hold on one second. Okay. So we have here the page of the Talmud, and you see it also on the screen. Okay, so the center part is actually the text of the Talmud itself. Everything around it is commentary. If you look at some of the volumes, this is one volume of the Talmud, but some of them have more than one tractate inside. Some of them have up to 2 or 3. I wanted to bring from my set of the full thing where you see the full size and so on, but I took this is one I studied from when I was in yeshiva, and but the actual this tractate this particular tractate, Baba Metzia, which is actually the one we're going to be studying from tonight. So by divine providence. Okay. Like a couple lines from this. So this is 119 pages. Okay, that's this particular tractate.
Mm-hmm.
Around each page, as you can see here, is commentary. In the back, all this is commentary. No, this is in Hebrew. The English Talmud, if you buy an English art scroll Talmud, so they actually have this. This one is probably in, I think it's in 2. Some of them are even in 3 volumes. They don't have any commentary in the back. They put each page of the Talmud is spread into 3 or 4 pages, and at the bottom they bring highlights in the notes of different commentaries that allow the reader to have a clear understanding, and they don't have to actually go. Many people use. We have one right now. It's in storage. Hopefully, in the near future, we'll be able to take it out of storage. Okay. So here you have the page of the Talmud. There are as I said, there are 63 volumes. The Talmud is not really a book. I'll show you a book. Usually there's an author to the book. Even the Torah, right? The Torah has an author. Who's the author of the Torah?
Hashem.
Good evening.
We can start now. I'm here.
Okay. So we have an author of the Torah. Who's the author of the Torah? God.
Am
Right?
I stuck sitting next to you again?
You could do that if you want, but let's continue. It's good to see you.
Right?
So the Torah, the author is God, right? As God gave it over to Moses. Every word was given over from God. So it's the author is God. If you go to the prophets, take any prophet. Joshua, who was the author? Joshua. Okay. If you go to the writings, the book of Kohelet was written by King Solomon. The book of Esther was written by Mordechai. Every book, if you buy a book from the store, it has an author. The only book, or one of the few books that don't have an author is the Talmud. So let's understand what the Talmud is. So it's not written by an author. We have to find out who wrote it. Where does it come from? Sure, my phone is not on ringtone. Okay, it's not. I did something. Okay. So let's understand. Let's go here. We have on page 96 and page figure 3.1. That is you have the page that I put up on the board, and this page is actually from the Tractate of Shabbos, which is a very, very long tractate. So basically, to summarize, it consists of 63 tractates. It records the teachings, discussions, and deliberations of hundreds of sages over a period of about 600 years. Now, the Talmud, as we'll see, and we're going to watch a video, is comprised of Mishnah and Gemara. So tonight, we're going to try to understand what the difference is between Mishnah and between Gemara. So now you understand that we have the Talmud, we have Mishnah, you hear about Mishnah, you hear about Gemara. How does it all come together? Who wrote it? Where did it come from? And so on. And now we also know that it has dozens of commentaries that explain it and discuss it. So the Talmud begins, if you look at the map, once again, if we look at the map, so we see it starts about 100 years before the Common Era. Where's my map? Oh, it's under my book. You can look at the very bottom, you'll see it starts about 100 years before Common Era, and it continues till about 500 years into the Common Era. Okay. Let us go into our video, and our video will give us a little bit more insight before we start going into some details. It will break it up for us so that we can appreciate it better.
This is the Talmud. 63 tractates, 523 chapters, 2 million words. After the Bible, the Talmud is the most important work of Jewish literature and has defined Jewish learning for centuries. From the outside, the Talmud looks like a book, albeit a rather formidable book, but from the inside, it looks more like this. Why is it so complicated? To decipher the Talmudic daf, or folio page, we first need to understand what the Talmud is, how it came to be created, and what a volume of Talmud contains. A volume of Talmud is not a book, it's a library of books. A typical volume of Talmud might include more than 100 works composed by hundreds of authors over a period of more than 1,800 years. Let's deconstruct the daf and then rebuild it layer by layer. The oldest part of the Talmud is the Mishnah. Compiled by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi in the Holy Land more than 1,800 years ago, the Mishnah was the first officially transcribed record of Torah law, which up until that point had been handed down through the generations as an exclusively oral tradition. The Mishnah, however, is very concise, almost a shorthand. Over the next 300 years, many hundreds of Torah sages analyzed, discussed, and debated the teachings contained within the Mishnah, and these discussions became the Gemara, which together with the Mishnah constitute the Talmud. There are many pages of Gemara for each Mishnah, as these discussions often range far afield to include many additional teachings covering virtually every topic under the sun. The Gemara was completed in the beginning of the 6th century in Babylonia, written mostly in the Aramaic dialect that was the spoken language of the Jewish people at the time. Studying the Talmud is a challenging task. It requires knowledge of its often obscure terminology, being familiar with the many references to parallel Talmudic teachings, and an ability to follow the complex, multi-tiered arguments presented in its discussions. In fact, the Talmud presented on its own would be a closed book to all but the most advanced Talmud scholar. So over the centuries, hundreds of commentaries were written to decipher, explain, and discuss the Talmudic text. Some of these were published alongside the Talmud itself in recognition that they are indispensable to any attempt to properly understand the text. Rashi, the most basic and comprehensive of all Talmudic commentaries, was placed alongside the Talmudic text in some of the earliest manuscripts and published editions of the Talmud. But when one Talmud scholar writes a commentary, other scholars will offer alternative explanations or have additional questions and issues they feel the need to address. Flanking Rashi on the daf is Tosfot, which is actually an anthology of commentaries by dozens of sages, including a number of Rashi's disciples and descendants. The analytic and dialectic style of the Tosfot commentaries strongly influenced the manner in which Talmud has been studied over the centuries throughout Europe and beyond. Over the years, more elements were added to the daf to aid the student's navigation of the text. But there's a limit to how many commentaries a page can hold, even an oversized folio page of Talmud. So other major commentaries were added to the back pages of each tractate for ready reference, and many, many more. In addition, many more commentaries on the Talmud were published and continue to be published each year in separate volumes. Today, if you wish to research a complex issue, compare and contrast different opinions on a topic, trace back their sources, examine the issue's applications in multiple fields, you can open multiple windows on your screen and even hook up more screens to your computer. But centuries before Windows 1.0, centuries before electronic information technologies, Jews committed to exploring the multi-chambered laboratory of wisdom called the Talmud had already invented the original hypertext, the daf.
One of the interesting things about the Talmud, and before we go to the, one second, we have this slide too. Okay. Is that Judaism encourages discussions and constant learning. So we're always learning. And the Talmud is a conversation that is not something that took place hundreds of years ago, but it is a conversation that continues to this very day, which is why people are still studying the Talmud. because they're continuing this conversation. The other thing is, and today, there are so many Jewish people who are businessmen, spend their day working, making a living, come home in the evening, take care of their kids, if they still have young kids, if they have young kids at home. And then, before they end their day, they study Talmud. There are many people who go through the Talmud. There's something called Daf Yomi, where they do a page of Talmud every single day, and they finish complete the entire Talmud in a cycle of 7 years. There's some people who do a side of a page a day. And when we talk about a page in the Talmud, so a page in the Talmud in the Hebrew, they do on Shabbos too. Yeah. You have the book, right? So a page of the Talmud is actually, when people say a page, it's not a side, it's 2 sides. That's a page. So if someone does half a page, it's a side. Okay? In Hebrew, it's called a daf, and the half a side is called an amud, a column. So there are people who do a page a day. Some people who study with a teacher every single day, and they listen to the teacher, and the teacher explains everything, and they get most of it, and then they move on. Sometimes there are certain parts, depending on what kind of mind you have, because everybody thinks differently. And some people are better at math, and some people are better at the English language, and some people are better at law. And the accountant might enjoy one part of the Talmud, and the lawyer might enjoy another part of the Talmud, and then the simple layman might enjoy another part of the Talmud. So different people, or even understand different parts. But the idea is that the Talmud is for everyone. It's part of our life, and it's always been that. And so, in this sense, it's much more than a book. It's the flavor. It's part of the Jewish life. Okay, so it's much more than a book. It's a way of thinking, and it's a way of relating to the world around us. And really, the Talmud allows us to appreciate things from a much deeper perspective, rather than looking at things from a very external perspective. A lot of times people this always fascinates me. A lot of times people will jokingly criticize or say, oh, they heard some law, and come on. Why do you have to come up with that? What they're missing is so many layers to appreciate that. Almost like, they show the pictures of where you could see an old lady and a young lady on the same face, right? Sometimes someone has to open up your eyes to be able to see more. And once you study and you understand that there's more to the picture than you saw, you start to see more to the picture, and then you can start appreciating life in a very different way. So the more we study Talmud, and the more we learn to analyze and to see the depth, we start to appreciate life and see things differently. And a lot of times we're able to tackle things in our own lives in a different way than we would without the Talmud, because the Talmud teaches us to analyze, to see things differently. And then, again, it changes the way we think, and it changes the way we relate to the world around us. Now, we have a lot of other parts of Torah. We have halacha, Jewish law. We have Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism. We have Jewish philosophy. We have so many different parts of Torah. Now, some of the parts are included in the Talmud, ethics, etc. So what is unique about the Talmud? So the Talmud, after the 24, and I started saying this before, after the 24 books of the Torah, of the written Torah, it is, even though it was written, recorded many, many years later, 1,500 years later, it is to this day the most authoritative part of the oral Torah. Everything that we study and everything that's written in Jewish law comes back to one place, the Talmud. Why is that? Anybody want to share why that is? Why that might be?
Because they're holier than us.
History. And but pointing on the part that something that we've discussed in the previous weeks, and something that Alan sort of touched upon before, is that the Torah, the written books, the 24 books of the Torah, are the source, right? The Talmud, on the other hand, is the body of Torah. So you have the source and you have the body. Everything in the body traces back to the source, right? Every part of the body traces back to the source. We spoke a little bit about the DNA in the very first class, and that from the DNA, you have every part of the Torah, every part of the body. And so the same thing is every part of the oral Torah comes from the source, from the Torah. So there's nothing in the oral Torah, in the thousands and thousands of volumes that we have, there's nothing in any of it that doesn't have source in the Torah, in the 24 books of the Torah. You could trace every part of it back to the 24 books. But it's a building block, like we explained last week. It based on the 13, we spoke last week a little bit about the 13 principles upon which one has to use in order to be able to decipher the Torah and to expand on the Torah, which those 13 principles are followed right through the entire Talmud and every part of the Torah.
All right, I have a quick question for you.
Sure.
The rules, the laws, however you want to put it down, about Shabbos, about carrying, about turning on a light or starting a fire. There are rules about men wearing pants and women wearing skirts or dresses. A lot of that is rabbinical law. They're getting that from the Talmud, correct?
So were you in part of the class last week?
I must be.
Okay. I only say that because I don't want to I don't want to spend a lot of time on that. Because if you follow the 13, first of all, two things.
What I'm questioning is rabbinical law.
What's the question?
Okay. So let's first understand what the Talmud is, and we'll get into halacha next week.
Okay.
And then we can discuss it. But very briefly, we have to understand, and I emphasized this last week or the week before, and I want to say it again because it's important that we understand that when Moses taught the written Torah, he didn't just teach the written Torah. He explained it. And he explained how we expand it and elaborate and understand it so that we could further understand it and appreciate it. And if we follow those directions, we know that it's true to Moses. We spoke about the teachings of Rabbi Akiva and Moses seeing that in a vision. This is all, and using the DNA as an example, every part of rabbinic law and every part of the discussions is based on the DNA of the Torah. That is what God wanted. God wanted us to be part of the process, to be part of the discussion. The written Torah is not up for discussion. That is the source. The rest of it is up for discussion as long as we stay true to the principles. And no one, you every single law that we have that's rabbinic, as we used last week, we spoke about the tefillin, and we used an example where we saw in the Medrash how we could go back to the verse and every single detail about the tefillin, which is not in the Torah. The Torah just says put them. We don't know where to put them, what to put. Every single detail we analyzed, and we were able to see how the Torah makes reference. We spoke about words in the Torah that have the same translation, and from one to the other, we could learn. If one is not clear, we could go to the other one and we can get clarity. If something is next to one law is next to another law, we could get clarity. But ultimately, Moses was the one who taught us how to do that. And so rabbinic laws are not something where someone comes up one day and says, you know what, there's a problem outside, let's come up with a good new idea, stop sign. What's the source of the stop sign? I don't know where the source of the stop sign is. The source of the stop sign, one guy decided, he came up with a good idea and he put up a stop sign. In Jewish tradition, in Jewish law, it doesn't work that way. Every single law, you're going to be able to trace it back, except you might need a few hours. For all the questions that you asked in those 30 seconds that you asked your question, you probably need about 2 to 3 months of studying, not an hour a day, probably 4 or 5 hours a day, and you'll have all your answers, and you'll have clarity. The problem is we ask questions, and we ask them again, and we don't have the time to go and to actually study and to go through all of those hours and hours. So we come to the bottom line, and then you have a broken chain from the beginning. So we're going to get one example of, last week we really spoke about how the chain of how you come from the Torah all the way down to halacha, and we used an example so you could see how it's done. This week we're going to do something a little different, but I think that answers the question. Let's go now to the history. The history that we have all the way back from the giving of the Torah, I hope that was helpful.
Yes.
Okay. Is based on the Rambam, the teachings of the Rambam. We know the Rambam lived about 1,000 years ago and passed away in 1204. Maimonides. We're going to talk about law, and Rambam was an authority of codifying Jewish law, and therefore we will talk a little bit about him next week. But we're going to understand a little bit of history because he explains the history. So let's have a look over here. The Talmud contains 2 parts. We already spoke about it. The 2 parts. One is the Mishnah, which was composed at the end of the 2nd century, which is the first officially recorded summary of the oral Torah. So basically, it's a summary. What happened was, for those 1,500 years from when the Torah was given until that point, it was the oral Torah. What would they do? They would discuss it. So teacher would share what his teacher taught, and he would explain it to the next generation. And then they would discuss it. And then there would be questions. And then they would have to go back to the sources of the information that they had from their teachers to be able to try to answer the questions. So it was a discussion. The entire those 1,500 years, everything was being discussed. Then we have the Gemara, which was compiled at the end of the 5th century, which is basically all of those 400 years from when the Mishnah was completed until the Mishnah was about after the last book of Tanakh. So we'll get into that also a little bit. But we'll get it in a second. So the Talmud then comes a little bit later. It's completed at the end of the 5th century, and it's structured as discussions on the Mishnah with additional teachings. Okay. So here you have the history of the oral Torah. There was 500-year gap after the written Torah before any major works were transcribed, which means basically they were continuing to write the written Torah through the prophets and the writings for 1,000 years after Moses. So there was the 5 books of Moses that was written. Then for another 1,000 years, for the next 1,000 years, there were prophets who were giving over prophecy, and that was being recorded in the other books. Who decided what gets put into the book? So that was based on let's go to text number 1 on page 99. Before I read the text, I want to just mention that Moshe Rabbeinu set up a Sanhedrin, which is a Supreme Court. Moses set up a Supreme Court, and they were the ones who ultimately made decisions, and there were 70 judges on the Supreme Court, and those judges, ultimately, they came to a conclusion. We always pass the law is that you follow the majority. They would come to a conclusion, and for those first 1,000 years, and even further until the time of the mission, even later, once a decision was made, every Jewish person followed that decision. There was no arguments. Once it was decided in the High Court by the greatest scholars of the generation, that was it. They decided it, and now every single Jewish person at the time accepted it. The problem was, as we see, what happened later on, as Jewish people left in the time of the Babylonians, they left and they went into Iraq to Babylonia, into the time of the Romans, Babylonians, and then later at the time of the Romans, where the Jewish people started to spread out. Now, they didn't have that structure anymore, where everybody was following one Supreme Court. So now you have a challenge of who to follow. So that's where a lot of the arguments and discussions come, and later different traditions, different customs, the Sephardic, Ashkenazic, and so on, which follow different customs, because there wasn't one set of laws that everybody followed, which happened in the first 1,000 years. So everything was very clear. No one really had you don't really have a question, well, which one, who should I follow? Why am I following this one, that one? Because everybody knew this was the way it was. Moses established it. They also had smaller courts. If the smaller courts couldn't decide something based on information, they went to the higher courts, and ultimately everything was decided by the courts, and Moses was the one who established it. So let's have a look. In the year 444 before Common Era, that was the time where the last, the Anshe Knesset Hagdola, and they were the ones who finally authorized the final works of the Tanakh, of the Nevi'im and Ketuvim, of the prophets and the writings. After that, when they sort of fell apart, that Sanhedrin, that court, they were the ones, actually, the Anshe Knesset Hagdola were also the ones who established many things, including the prayers and so on, which is what Knesset Hagdola, and that will never change.
Supreme Court?
Yeah.
Oh.
Okay. Kol HaMitzvot. So we're going to read in text number 1. All the commandments, this is from Maimonides, that were given to Moses at Mount Sinai were given together with their explanation. The explanation is what we call the Oral Torah. Moses transcribed the entire Torah by his own hand before his passing. But he did not transcribe its explanations. But he did explain it. Rather, he instructed them to the elders and to Joshua and to the rest of Israel. He did it to each one. So the way it worked was that he would tell it first to the elders, then he would say it to Joshua, then he would call the next group in. It doesn't really tell you the order of how that happened. But basically, everyone got to hear it numerous times, but at least once for Moses. This is why it's called the Oral Torah, because Moses gave it over orally. From the days of Moses until Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, who was the one who composed the Mishnah, no one composed a text for the purpose of disseminating the Oral Torah in public. Rather, in each generation, the head of the court or the prophet of that generation would write their own notes of the teachings they received from their teachers and teach them orally to the public. I mentioned this previously, that they would take notes. Similarly, each person would write them down for themselves according to their ability. the teachings they heard regarding the explanations of the Torah and its laws, as well as the new concepts that were deduced in each generation using one of the 13 rules of biblical and accepted by the higher courts. So it continued until the time of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. So I said before, it was the court of 70. I want to just make a correction. There was 71 in the court. I'm going to get into another time why. So here's what I said before. At first, text number 2. At first, there were few disputes of matters of Torah law in Israel. Rather, a court of 71 magistrates sat in the chamber of chiseled stone in the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. 2 additional courts of 23 magistrates sat at the entrance of the Temple Mount and at the entrance of the Temple courtyard. And additional courts of 23 sat in the cities of Israel. So they had many established courts. It wasn't one rabbi or the rabbis deciding, oh, you know what? I'd like to put a stop sign today. I'd like to put a fire alarm system. Let's put one in. This was discussions and all based on the principles taught by Moses. When a matter under dispute needed to be addressed, they would inquire of the court in their city. If the sages of the court had received a tradition regarding the matter, they told it to them. If not, they would go to the court in a nearby city. If they had received a tradition, they told them. If not, they went to the court at the entrance of the Temple Mount. If they received a tradition, they told them. If not, they would go to the court at the entrance of the Temple courtyard and said, so I expounded, and so have my colleagues expounded. So I learned, and so my colleagues learned. And if they had received a tradition, they told them. If not, they both went to the chamber of chiseled stone, where the court sat from the time of the daily morning offering to the time of the daily afternoon offering. On Shabbat and festival days, they sat in the Chayil, a different part of the temple. The question were presented to them. If they had received the tradition, they told them. If not, they took a vote. Because that is how Moses taught. If you don't have an answer, you take a vote. If the majority said impure, they deemed it impure. If the majority said pure, they deemed it pure. So that is how the halacha came to be. Halacha came to be by an issue arose, and they had to make a decision. If there's no source for it, they have to base it. So now, their discussion, their vote, was not based on their own logical understanding. They didn't say, oh, well, I think, makes sense to paint the wall brown. No, based on what I studied, and they would have to bring proof from the teachings and try to connect it. And if they could bring proof, then they were able to get their colleagues to join them and to agree. And then you would be able to create and to build that majority or minority based on the discussion. So again, it wasn't like 10 people say, well, okay, I think logically it makes sense that the guy with the dirty face is not going to wash his face, and the guy with the clean face is going to wash his face. It wasn't logical like that. They had to go back to the sources and figure it out, and based on that, they would come up. Okay. Now, in the early period of the Common Era, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi realized that being that Jewish people are had already for many years been dispersed and don't have the courts anymore to make those decisions, and issues are coming up, and they don't have the ability to go back to the source, because where's the source? I don't know, some rabbi had it somewhere. We don't know where he is. He's in Israel. We're in Babylonia. So he came up with a thing like this. We're going to write down all the major principles. All the major principles, the major teachings, we're going to write them down. And hence, he wrote down the what we call the Mishnah. Let's read text number 3. Again, this is all from the Rambam. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi collected all the teachings, all the laws, and all the explanations and commentaries that were handed down from Moses, and those that were taught by the courts in each generation. You imagine what kind of work this was. And if you realize how much has been elaborated on that to this day, and how precise it was, it's one of the most incredible pieces of work that exists in this world today. Concerning the entire Torah. From all of these, he composed the text of the Mishnah. He taught it in publicly and revealed it to the Jewish people, who all wrote it down and disseminated it everywhere. So everybody, he taught it, he compiled everything, taught it, people wrote it down, and it started to disperse. Why did he do this and not leave matters as they were? The idea was that the oral Torah was supposed to be conversation. Because he saw that the students of Torah were becoming fewer, new troubles were constantly arising, the Roman Empire was spreading throughout the world and becoming more powerful, and the Jewish people were being dispersed to the far ends of the earth. He therefore composed a single text that would be available to everyone so that it could be learned quickly and would not be forgotten. Okay, if you look at page, I don't know, it doesn't tell me which page you have, but it's here. What page is that? 104. Page 104. You see here, there are 63 tractates, 523 chapters in the Mishnah. Okay? They are divided into 6 orders, 6 starim. Okay? I wish they put this also on the board, but they don't. But they put a picture of 6 books, so that's helpful. So we have, one second, let's go back here. So we have the 6 volumes of the Mishnah. We have Zerayim. If you're looking, and I think everybody has a book, so we're good. So let's have a look. We have Zerayim, which is seeds. It starts off with the daily prayers, but it's mostly agricultural laws to do with the land. Very important because these are laws that for much of Jewish history were practical, everyday laws that people needed to but there's other also spiritual reasons why this is put first, because daily prayer reminds us that there's a God, and those who work with agriculture are able to recognize that they rely on rain, on water. That means that they rely on the blessings from God, because without something coming down from heaven, they don't have produce, and they don't have what they need. So they're able to recognize God, and so that's why we start with Zerayim. Okay, then we have Moed. Moed is the next most important thing in Jewish daily calendar, which is the Shabbos and the festivals, basically the Jewish calendar, what laws are involved. Then you have Nashim, which literally means women, which is laws related to women, like to marriage, divorce, and so on. The next part is called Nizikin, which is damages. So if you want to be a lawyer, this is a good section to study, civil and criminal law. Then you have Kachim, which is all the sacrifices, the daily temple service, and as well as part of Kachim, which is sacred things, is also the kosher dietary laws, can be found in that section. Finally, you have Taharot, which are the laws of ritual impurity. Much of it today, which is not applicable because we do not have a temple, and therefore we don't need to live on the spiritual level that we did. But of course, today there are some laws of Tahara, Tuma, and Tahara which are still applicable, which is one of the reasons that we come back from a funeral. We wash our hands in Tilat Yadayim. It's very important. We actually have a tradition that you come. I know I'm just going off a little bit, but I enjoy the stuff. So the idea is when one comes back from a funeral, we talk about. I'm just finishing off why this is important. We actually don't enter into a house, into a building, before washing our hands, because we don't want to bring that spiritual impurity that one receives. Put a cup outside so that you have water, or if it's a very cold day, you have someone bring out 5 minutes before you get home. You tell them to put out a hot cup of water, and then you come home and it's perfect to wash your hands. So, but that's Tahara.
If you don't wash your hands, what happens?
You bring ghosts into your home.
I went to a funeral on Sunday. I didn't want to.
So I'm sure you wash your hands since. Okay. If you haven't, you definitely should leave. Okay. So within the Mishnah, the Mishnah was written very concisely. You have to remember the Mishnah was written at a time where they didn't have printing, they didn't have computers. Everything was written down. It had to be very concise.
Sure.
And many laws, it was written in such a way that you can learn, as we'll see today, that you can learn a lot out of one Mishnah. It only includes the rulings and discussions up to the time of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. So after that, the discussions are already in the Gemara part of the Talmud. Okay. The Mishnah created a core text for the Oral Torah. The Oral Torah remained a living tradition despite its transcription. So even though the Torah it's now been written, nevertheless, the idea is that it should continue to be a conversation. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, again, we explained why he was afraid that it would be forgotten. He did not take it upon himself without finding a verse in Tehillim from the written Torah to support his decision to write it down. So even writing down the oral law, Stu, where everything we say could be traced back to somewhere in the written law, the reason Rabbi Yehuda was able to write it down, even though it's supposed to be the oral Torah, he found a verse in the Torah which says, Eis la'asot la'Hashem hefeiru Toratecha, that sometimes in order to preserve godliness and clarity, one has to do things that are not traditional, as long as they stay within. You have a source, which is what he did. He found a source to prove that this time he could do it. But again, the point of it was not to have something written and now it's a written law, a Torah. The point was that you should have a source so that we don't forget what the original discussions of the oral Torah was, so that we don't fall away from the source and from the clarity and from the truth of Torah. Okay, so we understand what the Mishnah is. Again, the Mishnah was written by Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, very, very concise. Every Mishnah, they have when I was 10 years old, I received, with commentary, 3 volumes of the Mishnah, of all the Mishnahs. Today, when you buy the Mishnah in English, it's about 24 volumes because it has a lot of translation and commentary already, so that explaining the laws, because without a teacher, you can't just read a Mishnah and understand every detail, because as I said, every single word in the Mishnah, in a not exactly the same way as the written Torah, but in a very similar way to the written Torah, that everything's precise. You can't compare, like in the Torah, you could compare 2 words that are very similar, right? Or the same words written in 2 different places. You could learn one from the other. You can't do that in the Mishnah. But if you pay attention, as we'll do today for the last 10 minutes or so of the session, we'll see how every single word, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, when he wrote it down, was so precise so that you could learn many other laws from it. Now, I want to also just mention, before we go into the Gemara, that the Mishnah was not the only part of that period that was written down. There was something called the Breita that was written down, but it wasn't published and disseminated in the same way. But later, there were people who kept notes of what was called the Breita. If you go into the Talmud, which we're going to do now, you'll see the Talmud many times, to bring clarity to a law in the Mishnah, it quotes from the Breitas that we don't really have. There's no book of Breitas today like there is a Mishnah. The only way we have the Breitas today is because we still have the Gemara that recorded those discussions and had the exact quote of the Breita, which was the other, those laws written down at the same time of the Mishnah. But because they weren't disseminated in the way the Mishnah was, they never really got around, and people didn't keep them, except for the ones that were written in the Talmud. So what's the Gemara? So basically, we now have the oral Torah written down for the first time by Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. Over the next 400 years, they are discussing it. Hundreds of sages are discussing it. And we are going to, again, there isn't much that we're doing in the actual text tonight, although we will do some more. Let's have a look. Now, how many Talmuds are there?
How many Talmuds?
How many Talmuds? We know there's 63 volumes. How many Talmuds are there? Did I confuse everyone?
You're talking about the three different types?
What's 3 different types?
You have the Jerusalem,
There's one.
Babylonian.
Oh, okay, you're right, but there's only 2. Two. Jerusalem, and there is, okay. So there are teachings, the Gemara is basically teachings of the sages from both Jerusalem and Babylonia over a period of 300 years after the Mishnah was compiled. And it's discussions of hundreds of sages, all based on the Mishnah and the Braita that they had still copies of.
Where does the Dead Sea Scrolls fit in? Have they matched that to anything?
I'm not going to answer that tonight. Okay, I don't want to get carried away. I want to stay with the Mishnah. Okay, so on page 106, you have a map. Yeah, so you can have a look at the areas in A and C, which is where many of the sages were at the time after the period of the Mishnah. We have the sages studying in, well, A is where the Mishnah was, B is the Babylonian Talmud, and C is where the Jerusalem Talmud was. Okay, so it was most of it was the study in Tiberias, but because it was in Israel, it was called the Jerusalem Talmud. So you have explanation there. I'm not going to go too much into it, but basically we will see the difference between the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud, but the Jerusalem Talmud was written first, and then came the Babylonian Talmud. Okay, what the Gemara does is unpacks the Mishnah. We have this very concise oral law. Now we have to unpack it and understand it. So there are 3 ways of doing it. The first one is, let's have a look, is by analyzing the Mishnah and comparing it with parallel teachings. For that, you would need the Braita, which is what I mentioned before. That's why I mentioned it. So in order to analyze the Mishnah, you have to find either another Mishnah somewhere else to analyze, because you have to see the style of the text. And if you look at style of the text, then you could start realizing the way they're writing things and start to understand what they're teaching. Or you could look at the Braita, which was written in the same time period. If you read a book that was written this year, it's probably filled with emojis, right? If you go back a few hundred years, you've got different kind of language, even within English, right? Today, you don't really write very much. It's either emojis or what's the other thing? Would you just write TY? Or you just write TY? You don't know what TY is.
Shorthand.
No.
Shorthand. What do they call it? Shorthand. So today, thank you very much. Thank you so very much. What do you write?
DSM-1.
TYSVM. Okay, right? And that's what people are typing today. So think about 200 years from now, what would happen? They have to now start analyzing what all these codes mean so that they could try to decipher it. We're going to have a new Talmud on the English language. But that's basically what the Talmud is doing, trying to figure out, you compacted this all into the Mishnah, but how do we understand it? How do we unpack it? The other thing, which is very much in line with what we discussed before, Stu, and that is going backward. So we have to go backward as well, which is try to figure out what are the sources. Okay, we understand that it says something, but what are the sources? Everything has to have a source. Where? In the written Torah. So we've got to go back to the source and understand the principles in order to be able to understand the Mishnah. And then the most important thing, of course, is learning how to go forward. And that is how to apply whatever we've learned into our daily lives. So, begins with the commentary on the Mishnah and extends to so what happens? So, in the Gemara, you have like this. Let me turn this down so those of you who are online can see it. You have, I don't know if you're going to be able to see it clearly, but I'll give you an example. See if I can find it right away. Okay. The first Mishnah in this tractate starts right here at the beginning on page 2, because every Torah book starts on page 2. Because page 1 is the knowledge that it's all from Hashem, from the one God. So here we have the Mishnah, and the Mishnah is about 10 lines here. Here we start analyzing. And now they're discussing. And they're discussing. And they're discussing. And it's going all the way. I'm trying to find the next Mishnah. I'm doing this upside down. Not so easy. Going back to Europe and to other countries where they weren't very wealthy, there were 4 ways of learning how to read. You know this?
Yeah.
It's true. One was the right way. You had 4 children in a classroom. They couldn't afford 4 books for each child. So one child would get used to learning it the right way, or 2. The other 2 would look from the right side. The other 2 would look from the left side. And the other 2 would look from the top. So they all learned how to do it a different way. Okay. I went 9 pages and I found the next Mishnah. This Mishnah is a very small Mishnah. Now, what happened in all of these pages? Numerous things can happen in all these pages. You know what happens when I teach? Sometimes I get carried away, right? And that's what happens sometimes in the Talmud. They get carried away. Now, not carried away with nonsense, but carried away with sub-related topics, parables, history, philosophy, and advice. And sometimes it could be many more than 10 pages. And sometimes the pages could be expanded, where there's so much and so little commentary, because now it's parables and you don't really need so much commentary on it. So there are some pages where you have very little. Sometimes you can have 5 lines of the Talmud on the page and the rest is commentary, because it's a complex idea. So the commentary, they have to give a lot of commentary. And sometimes it's parables and other ideas where you could read it yourself. And so it gives you very little commentary and a full, massive page of text. Okay. Now let's move on. Okay. Since the Talmud, no Torah work afterwards has the same standing. Basically, what happened was that once the Talmud was put together in Babylonia, over several hundred years of discussions, this became the most important authority, and that is because even though they didn't have the Sanhedrin, but they still had the center of Judaism in one place. There were a few of the scholars in Jerusalem, and there were most of them, and most of Jewish life was in Babylonia, which is where? In Iraq. Well, Babylonia is Iraq.
Actually,
Yes.
Babylonia is Iraq,
Yeah.
right?
isn't it? You mean Mesopotamia?
Yeah, well, you could go
But
there.
then what?
If you want to go back further.
Yeah, Tigris.
So later, so there was time where they were in Persia, but the Babylonia is in Iraq. You could look on your map. You could see. Okay,
At times, Persia may have been very large.
there could be, but it's known as the area of Babylonia itself is in Iraq. But anyway, the center of Judaism was there. So if there was and there were messengers going back and forth over those few hundred years, so if there was a discussion, a question, it was still very central and very easy to communicate. After that time, once the Talmud was written, and then Jews started to spread all through, heading towards Europe and towards different parts of the world, there wasn't a central place for Judaism, and therefore you couldn't make central decisions anymore. And that was after the Talmud was written, and now you couldn't make something that's central to every single Jew. And therefore you have this community book as its authority, and this one who follows this book, and it's both from God. It both, as long as they're following what the principles, they're both from God, except one's following one opinion and one's following a different opinion. So because that central part of the Jewish community is not the way it was, we can't make something that's uniform for the entire Jewish people anymore. It just doesn't work. But the Talmud was still in that period of time where they were able to do that. So every single Jew at that time was able to say, well, we accept the Talmud. We're happy with it. This is what we're doing. We got it. But then later, someone came up, the Rambam. He wrote his book, right? What happened? The ones in the other country said, who's the Rambam? What kind of authority is he? Why should we follow him? And they had a point. They didn't know the Rambam. Why would they accept him as an authority? Okay, so years later, the Rambam became more well-known and people studied his works and they realized that he had insight that others didn't have. And even today, the Rambam is becoming more and more popular. So finally, because people have the text and people are able to anyway, so that's basically understanding the Talmud. It was the end of an era, and everything moves on. We spoke about the Jerusalem Talmud, which is discussions held in Israel between the year 200 and 350, and the Babylonian Talmud, which was basically discussions held till the year 505, and that's when it was completed, roughly around that time. It was the project of the Talmud was started by Rabbi Ashi and Rabbi Asi. They started it, then they passed away, and then it was continued by other sages. The teachers of the Mishnah were known as the Tanaim. This is not part of the course. And the Mishnah teachers of the Gemara were known as the Amoraim. Much like we have rabbis today, their name was Tana. Tana means teacher, and Amora means one who says, so the one who's giving over information to us. Okay. I'm going to move on to the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. There is a very big difference between them. And one of the central differences between the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud is the Jerusalem Talmud is much shorter. It's a very direct approach and very little arguments that are going on in the Jerusalem Talmud. The Babylonian Talmud is basically people fighting, rabbis and sages arguing, bringing sources back and forth, and it's much more of a dialogue between sages, very, very different than the Jerusalem Talmud. Let's have a look at an interesting thing from the Talmud that it says about the Jerusalem Talmud. It says that, it says about the Babylonian Talmud, text number 5, it says, "He has set me in dark places. Said Rabbi Yirmiyah, this is the learning of Babylonia." What does it mean? What happens when you're in a dark room? You trip on the way. So Jerusalem, there was clarity. In Israel, there's clarity. In Israel, there was clarity. In Babylonia, there was a lack of clarity. It was a place of darkness. And so the sages ended up tripping in the sense of trying to find their way in darkness. And when you're finding your way in darkness, it's much more difficult. And so you stumble, you fumble, and that's what was really going on in their discussions. As they're tripping on things, they're going back to the source and bringing out clarity. But first they're falling, and then they're bringing out the clarity. That's basically, look what it says here in text number 6. What is the meaning of the verse in Zechariah? I took for myself 2 staffs. The one I called Noam, pleasantness, and the other one I called Chovlim. Noam are the sages, which are destroyers, right? Noam are the sages of the land of Israel, who are gracious to each other in their deliberations of Torah law. They had nice discussions, very peaceful discussions. Couldn't have been that much fun. It's peaceful. But the Chovlim are the Babylonian sages who assault each other in their deliberations of Torah law. Okay. If I took you to a yeshiva where they're studying Talmud, you would go in and you would think they hate each other. You would think they hate each other.
Too much discussion.
Because they stand and they deliberate, they argue, and that's part of the way of learning Talmud. That you argue, you give your opinion, you explain why the other person isn't right, why you're right, and the other person fights back, and the whole day you fight. And when you finish the session, you close the book and you walk off to dinner together with a smile on your face. If only our discussions in life today as American citizens were that way, where we could sit around and have, the only reason why we cannot debate politics in Chabad, that's our policy, is for one simple reason, because people debate them and then they can't go to dinner together. We have people. It's a policy for forever. It was broken a little bit, and we had to reinstate the policy. But that is our policy in Chabad of Old Japan and in most Chabads. We don't speak politics because if there are people who could have a debate and fight with each other, but you're fighting ideas rather than fighting the person, then you could have it. But unfortunately, most people today can't do that, and it's a sad reality. And therefore, we can't really have debates today.
Why? Because in the Torah, it's too much idea. You must come to decisions, but next day more decision. It's non-stoppable of decision. Here it's left, right, or middle, and that's it.
No, that's not the reason. You might be right.
Political.
You might be right to some degree, but I think, okay, we're having debate right now, right? I think that the reason is that because people don't have a true love for each other when they start the conversation. And if people had a true love for each other when they start the conversation, even if they get into a fight when they have the conversation, when they walk away, they'll be able to continue their love. But if you start not having a true love for the other person, then you get carried away, and then you walk away, and you can't appreciate the other person. So anyway, it is 9:00. We have gone through the history. We've gone through the discussion of what it is. But the only thing that we didn't do, which we really wanted to do, is go through a case. So I'm going to do it. I'm going to try to do it without any conversation. Those of you who wish to continue for the next 10 minutes or so, feel free to stay. Otherwise, if you have to leave, I understand. But let me go into this this case. We're on page 113. We're going to read these sections of the Talmud, and I'll give you a little bit of insight. So the Mishnah says as follows: Shnayim she'oksim batalis. 2 people are grasping a garment. Very important, the way the Mishnah writes it. 2 people are grasping a garment. This one says, I found it, and this one says, I found it. This one says, all of it's mine, and this one says, all of it's mine. So most people read this and they say, oh, it's babyish, childish discussion over here. This one should swear, so what do? This one should swear that his share is in it is no less than half, and this one should swear that his share is in it is no less than half. And since we can't decide whose it is, they divide it. Sounds fair. Two kids are fighting, right? And they both say, so what do? You say, okay, I can't figure it out, so I'm going to divide it. The question is, why does the Mishnah start off with two people grasping a garment? Why can't you just tell us the two people are fighting over a garment? So there is a concept that you have to understand in Jewish law called chazaka. What's chazaka? Chazaka means chazaka means strong. That you have a proof of or a reason for us to believe that you have ownership over it. So if you see me driving my Rogue for the last 4 years or so, and you see me every day driving the car, and someone comes over and says one day, 1 second, whose car is that? We assume it's mine. Why would you assume that? Because you always see me driving it. So it's so if I came one day and I said, well, this guy's fighting over my car, so what do you mean? We know it's your car. We see you using it every day. So there's a concept of chazaka. In order to take ownership of anything in Judaism, you have to get ownership by either holding it or holding something. If it's land, you can't hold the land. Walking into the land. There's a way to get ownership over something. So if it's an animal, it's a car, you drive it. If it's an animal, you pull it, right? Or a small animal, you can hold it. But basically, you have to do something that demonstrates that it's yours. Once you take ownership by demonstrating it's yours, so then it becomes yours. So let's have a look at a case where Stu is now holding the bottle of water. Stu? Yeah? You claimed the bottle of water tonight. And guess what? I come along and I say, wait, Stu, that's not... Stu says, no, it's his. So in such a case, what are we going to do? How are we going to decide? Maybe he just stole it from me. We don't know that he had it yesterday or today, right? Maybe it was mine. So how are we going to decide? Anybody have a suggestion?
Well, it helps to have a witness.
Well, we don't know.
Okay.
Water was on the table before class. We all walked into class. Now he's holding it. I claim it's mine, and he claims it's his. So the Talmud tells us, based on a verse, going back to the source, text number 8, said Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani, from where do we know the rule that the one who is seeking to take property out of his fellow's possession, it is incumbent upon him to provide the evidence? We know it from the verse, whoever has a matter for adjudication should approach them. He must present the evidence. So, Hamotzi mechaver alav haraya means that if I want to take something from someone else and he's holding it, the one who has it keeps it. If I want to take it away from him, I'm the one who has to prove that it's mine. So yeah, if he says it's his and I say it's mine, who's holding it? He's holding it. So he doesn't have to bring proof that it's his. I would be the one to have to bring proof that it's mine, and we know that from a verse in the written Torah, in Shemos, in Deuteronomy, in Numbers,
Exodus.
In Exodus. Thank you very much. In Exodus. Okay, so we know this from Exodus, and this tells us that whoever has a claim on someone else, he's the one who has to bring the evidence. So Rashi says, why does the Mishnah say two people are grasping a garment? Says Rashi, have a look on page 115, text number 9. It is specifically in the case that they are both grasping the garment. Now you understand what the Mishnah is telling us. It's telling us that here we're talking about where both people are holding onto something, which means they must have found it at the very same time. And they both picked it up at the same time. And they're both claiming that it's theirs. And there's no way of discerning who's the true owner. meaning that both are in possession of it, and neither one has a stronger hold on it than the other. But if only one of them was holding the garment, then the other one has the status of the one who is seeking to take property out of his fellow's possession. And it would be incumbent upon him to provide proof by bringing witnesses that it is his. He would not be believed with just an oath. Let's have a look at a text number 10. Here's a story, a little story in the Talmud. There was a certain boat that two people were quarreling about. This one said, it's mine. The other one said, it's mine. Now, the way it's written is very, very simple, and it almost sounds like two kids arguing. But for those who are lawyers or rabbis or in other professions where you deal with people, you know that every day there are people who fight like this. The people in relationships, who business partners. It's mine. No, it's mine. I got it first. I came up with the idea. The logo is mine. The business name is mine, etc., etc. One of them came to court and says, "Listen, it's my boat. He claims it's his boat. I'll tell you what to do. Take it until I'm able to bring witnesses that it's mine." So what do? Do we take it away from the other one or not? Or not from the other one, because we say they're both claiming that it's theirs. Okay? So Rav Huna says we seize it. Rabbi Yehuda says we do not seize it. What did they do? The court decided that they're going to seize it. But the man went and did not find witnesses. He then said to the court, one second. Okay. He then said to the court, release the boat, and whoever is stronger will prevail. Now the question is, do we release it or do we not release it? He couldn't bring proof. The other guy doesn't have proof. So what are we going to do? Rabbi Yehuda said, we do not release it. Rav Papa found reason why we do. The law is we do not seize the property in such a case, but if the court does seize it, we do not release it. Okay. So we have a case where both people are holding onto it. We have a case where only one person is holding onto it, because then the other person has to bring a proof. And we have the third case where neither of them are holding. So now we have here like this. When two claimants, text number 11. When two claimants stand before us holding the garment, we are compelled to rule that the garment should be divided. Why? Because anytime that we see something in a person's possession, we're on page 118. Anytime we see something in a person's possession, like I gave an example with Stu with the water before, we need to regard it as their property, even though another person is contesting this and claiming that it is mine. Consequently, we cannot rule that whoever is stronger will prevail, as we do in the case cited in Bava Kama 334b regarding the boat. We can't say whoever is stronger will prevail. That case, however, is different, because neither of them is in possession of the property they are claiming. Right? No one has it. The court has no cause to stop any person from taking something that they claim is theirs. When we don't know who it belongs, the court has no cause to stop any person from taking something that they claim is theirs when we don't know who it belongs to. And therefore, let them fight about it. That's what we're going to do. It would therefore be wrong to rule that it should be divided, as we might be depriving a person of their property without just cause. How do you divide something just because two kids are fighting over it? Maybe one of them is the rightful owner, and then he only gets half. How do you do that? But in our case, where both claimants are possessors of the garment in the original text of the Mishnah, we are obligated to prevent one of them from robbing the other. So we have no choice but to rule that the garment should be divided. So again, we have the biblical source of chazaka, that if it's mine, I get to hold it. Now we say that if only one is possessing it, then the other one has to bring proof. If no one holds it, so then the court really should not get involved. Once they get involved, maybe they shouldn't give it back, so they don't fight over it. But in the beginning, the court can't decide and say that's mine over yours. Neither of us have it. It's a piece of land, let's say. I say it's mine. You say it's yours. I can't bring strong proof. You can't bring strong proof. So how's the court going to decide? Why should they take it away? So they have to fight, not physically, hopefully, But they have to fight until one comes up with proof, enough proof that it's his. When both of them are possessors, like our Mishnah, so then they have to step in and decide what to do. Now we have another Mishnah. Let's go to text number 12 on page 120. Two people entrusted money with a third person. One deposited 100 dinar. I'm going to try to finish in the next minute or two. One deposited 100 dinar and one deposited 200 dinars. Dinar is a currency in the time of the Talmud. Okay? So one deposited 100, 200, one deposited 200. So, okay, so you have a banker, and one guy comes to the banker and gives him 100. And the other guy comes, they came at the same time. You know, sometimes you go into the cleaners and they have two piles of clothing, and you say to the cleaners, like, 1 second, how are you going to know which one's mine? They both have white shirts and both have black pants. And he says, don't worry, I know. They come back the next week and it's a different shirt, right? So sometimes this happens. So the two guys came in and one deposited 100 and the other got 200. This one says the 200 are mine, and the other one says, hey, no, the 200 are mine, I give you 200. So what do? We give 100 to one, 100 to the other, because we know both of them gave 100. And the other is put away until Mashiach comes. That's what the Talmud says. Till the prophet Elijah comes, right? Because he's a prophet, and he'll be able to tell us who's the other 100, who the other 100 belong to. Said Rabbi Yosef, if we do that, the swindler loses nothing. One of them's lying. And the one who's lying gets back all his money. That's not fair. The one who gave his 200 is losing 100. That's not fair. Said Rabbi Yosef, if we do that, the swindle loses nothing. Rather, all of the money should be put away until Elijah comes. You have to put it into escrow. And then let's see who could come. A lot of times, what happens is when you do that, you put into escrow, as I know from experience, when someone comes and he claims money, and then they goes to the lawyer, they come to you, and they're lying, and what ends up happening is they know they can't take you to court, and they say, well, we'll settle for half, and we know how it works, and then you say, no, I'm only going to do this, and then you settle for half of that, and hopefully you come to some thing, and then the thief who's trying to get money will maybe get what he should have gotten in the first place, or close to it. Okay. The question is, why in our original Mishnah do we say you have two people who are holding a garment? Why don't we say here also that one of them's lying? If you came into the room, and Stu and I, we like to fight. We haven't had a good fight in a long time. Okay, just kidding. So Stu is holding this bottle, and he's pulling it from me. I'm holding the bottle, I'm pulling it from Stu. You walk in the room, and you see us fighting. Why is that any different than the two guys who came to claim that they both that the 200 is theirs? We're dividing it into half, right? So what's going to happen? You divide it in half. One of us who's lying is going to be receiving the other half. The half that's not theirs. So we have to understand the Mishnah. And this is what we're going to finish off with. The way it works is like this. And this is, it is as if both of them are holding the money. Since the Bailey, in whose possession the question of ownership was born, is holding the money on the strength of their authorization, and his hand is legally regarded as the extension of their hands. Basically, what we're saying is like this. Both people are holding it. Let's go into another text, and then I'll finish off, and I'll just explain. In that case of the disputed deposit, there is a certain certainly a swindler. In our case, who is to say there is a swindler? Perhaps both of them picked up the garment together. So I'm trying to rush this because I want to finish up. It's already a little late, and some people it's past their bedtime. And also it's there's a limit of how much after a long day we could sit. And I don't like to extend too much. I did tonight. I'll try to keep the other weeks to an hour and a half. The idea here is very simple. And that's how we analyze the text and what the text is telling us. That basic like this. What do we say? When someone is holding something, it's in their possession. We have reason to believe that it's theirs. If another person was claiming it, they would have to bring proof. So now we have two people holding it. It is possible that when we came into the room, we both saw this bottle and we both decided that we want it. He put his hand from the right, I put my hand from the left, and we both grabbed it at the very same moment. If that's the case, we are both possessors of it. So when both people are holding it, it is possible, unlike the other case where one of them is definitely a swindler, a liar, because we know only one person gave 100 and only one person gave 200. But here in this case, it is possible that both of them found it together. So two kids say, we were out in the yard today and we found a coin. Well, if you can't decide who was the real owner of it, I can't give it to you. No, it's very possible they found it together. They both picked it up together. They both picked it up together. They have equal rights. And that's why the Mishnah tells us to divide it. So the Mishnah is teaching us by giving us a few little words that they're possession together, the way the Mishnah, they grasp it together. The Mishnah is teaching us so that we can build upon and understand when we should divide, when we should keep. And that is just a little taste of the Mishnah and the Gemara, the way the Gemara elaborates on the Mishnah. And if